Hello, I'm Nick Offerman, white male translator for Gaslit Nation. To sum up this week's episode, kleptocracy anywhere is kleptocracy everywhere, and this is a transnational crime syndicate masquerading as a government. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Counsel.
Mr. Chief Justice.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send a question to the desk.
Thank you. Question from Senator Warren is for the House managers. At a time when large majorities of Americans have lost faith in government, does the fact that the Chief Justice is presiding over an impeachment trial in which Republican senators have thus far refused to allow witnesses or evidence contribute to the loss of legitimacy of the Chief Justice, the Supreme Court, and the Constitution?
I'm Sarah Kenzier, the author of the best-selling essay collection, The View from Flyover Country, and the upcoming book, Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the upcoming journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the Trump administration and rising autocracy around the world. Later in the show today, we'll run an interview with Olga Tokariuk, a journalist from Ukraine who covers Kremlin disinformation and propaganda and how it seeps into foreign media culture. This problem is not going to go away. As we said on this show many times before, Ukraine is a testing ground for Kremlin experiments, whether election hacking, social media information wars, including not only troll and bot farms, but the infiltration of mainstream news outlets, and hacking of vital infrastructure. The connection between corrupt governments in the West and Kremlin propaganda is also direct, as we've seen in the work of Putin's operative Paul Manafort and his replacement Rudy Giuliani in Ukraine, which has now culminated in the Senate sham impeachment trial. And so we're recording this Monday morning at the point where the GOP has voted to not allow witnesses, but has not yet voted to acquit the criminal president and therefore crown him criminal king. Andrea, do you have thoughts on this?
Do I ever? Well, lots of thoughts. So I want to talk about this show that I just started watching, which I highly recommend. It's called Succession. It's by HBO. And the reason why I started watching it is because in reading about the fires in Australia that killed over 1 billion animals and dozens of people, the cause of which was predicted in an investigation into how climate change was going to worsen fires in Australia and so forth. Science that was largely ignored by parties, political leaders in Australia. Now here we are. That set off for me a deep dive into a propaganda empire, and that is Rupert Murdoch's empire. Murdoch was the son of a major racist who believed in eugenics, which is the pseudoscience, the fake science that tries to justify white supremacy and so forth. Murdoch was heavily influenced by his father, went on to, building off his father's legacy, built a massive propaganda empire, starting in Australia, the UK, and the US. And what he basically did was he trampled on the laws meant to hold the power of media accountable and contained any sort of potential abuse of power in media. Murdoch trampled over those laws and rewarded the far-right politicians from Thatcher and Reagan who turned the other way, looked the other way with his trampling of those laws. And that's how he built an empire. So I was thinking a lot about that show Succession in preparing for this episode because there's a great line where the Rupert Murdoch character, played by Brian Cox, who is advising his children, who play the horrible poster children of why nepotism is so dangerous. This is the Murdoch family personified. It's a wonderful dark comedy on what it must be like to be in that den of vipers of the Murdoch family. And the character that's supposed to be the Rupert Murdoch character tells his daughter, why are you going into politics? It's the media that feeds the horse, and politics is what comes out from the other side of the horse. And he nails it. He absolutely nails it. And if you look at my film, Mr. Jones, It's exactly that. Media is a force of power. And wherever power exists, there exists the abuse of power. And so you have to speak truth to power, whether it's the media or government or elsewhere. And media, as we've seen through Rupert Murdoch, as we've seen in what we're going to be going over today in Kremlin disinformation, media, abuse of power in media, corruption in media, it can change the world to the point where a government in Australia gets to the point where it ignores the science for so long that over 1 billion animals are burned alive. And the abuse of power, the propaganda muddles the facts so grossly that you can't even have an honest, science-driven conversation on what to do about that and how to prevent it from ever happening again. So here we are in the jaws of the beast of Murdoch's propaganda empire and Kremlin and Putin's propaganda empire. That's really what today's episode is about. And so if you look at why Donald Trump was able to steal the presidential election and why the Republicans have fallen into line with Donald Trump, from Mitch McConnell to Lindsey Graham and others, it's simply because they were always meant for each other. They share the same values. They were the Republican Party in America today was born from Rupert Murdoch's propaganda empire. Brexit was born from Rupert Murdoch's propaganda empire. So it's no wonder the conservatives in America, the conservatives in the UK are largely aligned today with Putin's propaganda empire. These guys share the same values. They do not stand for journalism. They do not stand for facts. They do not stand for science. They do not stand for empathy. They do not stand for public service. They stand for power for the sake of power and making a ton of money, which will allow them to live above any accountability. There's even a line in Succession where somebody in Rupert Murdoch's den of vipers says that, how great it is to be rich because you can get away with anything and not have to deal with accountability. That's it. That's the name of the game. And to people who are coming from a very different set of values, they have a difficult time just grasping the simplicity of that, because why would anybody be so crass and heartless? Well, guess what? They are. And the people with decency can continue speaking their language of decency, but understand that when you're trying to deal with the forces we're up against, we are talking about two very different languages. And so it's up to us now, who stand for science, who stand for facts, who stand for empathy, to at least understand the language that the enemy is speaking with. And that is power for power's sake, corruption to avoid accountability, and more money than you could ever possibly imagine. Like unimaginable global garky wealth. That's what they want, even if it comes down to burning down the planet.
Yeah, I was going to say that this has always been the case, and you can see operators like Murdoch, beginning these sort of machinations and, merging with other oligarchs, other operators around the world, going all the way back to the 1980s and the 1990s, and a couple of things that changed there that allowed this to be possible was the repeal of the fairness doctrine in media in 1987, which on the show we've noted many times was a very significant year for Trump and his relationship with the Kremlin, and for this growing alliance of oligarchs and mafiosos and politicians and, unfortunately, people within our own government agencies, followed by the founding of Fox News in 1996. All of this has been in play for a long time. Another issue that rose to the fore in the late 1980s was climate change. And, I sometimes feel like I hallucinated this, because I remember being a little kid in the 1980s and everyone being so freaked out about climate change and about the impending doom of our Earth, and basically about all the things that have come to transpire now, the worst case scenarios, things like Australia burning to the ground. I remember the talking about, the hole in the ozone layer, and about acid rain, and about these being plot points on little TV shows for kids that I was watching, and, kids being given in school that book, like, 100 things you can do as a kid to save the Earth, McDonald's getting rid of the styrofoam for the McDLT, RIP McDLT. But, anyway, it was this thing, it was thought of as such an urgent crisis. And of course, it never went away as that. And we've seen movement, both within environmentalists, but more broadly, various accords that were supposed to stave off the worst aspects aspects of climate change. We had Al Gore with all of his warnings. But what's interesting to me is that this little cabal of people, like Murdoch and Trump and Putin, who have been aligned through various networks for now about 40 years, their networks thrived during this time where climate change was very rapidly getting worse. And their response to it was to always accelerate it, to exploit it, to root for it, to want the world to collapse and burn so that they could scoop up what remains. And, I've said this on the show before.
And so they can commit genocide against people of color.
Yes. That's what I was going to say is a depopulated Earth is easier for them to manage. And they have a hierarchy. Like, as you mentioned, Rupert Murdoch is a eugenicist. And we've seen eugenicist arguments appearing over and over again in places like the New York Times, mainstream outlets. We've seen them in other countries as well. And they have populations that they want to get rid of. And I think that this is just one more mechanism of doing so. But go on with what you were saying.
We should note that we're recording this show on Monday, February 3rd, because I had accepted an invitation to go to London very last minute. A very dear old friend of mine by the name of Andrea Maximovich, a Ukrainian who lives in London and works on development projects for Ukraine, he organized a screening of my film, Mr. Jones, in London, which quickly sold out. I mean, I think it's free, but several hundred people are going to be there. And it's at capacity at the moment. And I was trying not to go because I am very busy here with the show and everything. But I couldn't say no to Andriy because he was there at the very start of this journey. I wanted to share that with you so you get a sense of where my optimism comes from and the fact that I believe firmly in my heart that ultimately we will be okay. But that is going to be determined by our level of engagement and our refusal to look away. And so my story with Mr. Jones began final years of college, researching this as a curiosity. The story of my film was inspired by my grandfather, who lived through Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine, which killed millions of people in the Soviet Union, the vast majority Ukrainian. It was a deliberate man-made famine. They sealed the borders of Ukraine, refused to let journalists in. And my research focused on this real-life young Welsh journalist who was able to sneak into Ukraine, report on the famine directly, and then came out and said there was a man-made famine killing millions. And this was a shocking story. He was ultimately killed in mysterious circumstances, research strongly suggests by the Soviet secret police. And even though he's killed and his story is covered up, largely with the help of Walter Duranty, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times, and other leading voices in media, showing that, again, corruption in the media. This young man, his name is Gareth Jones, his truth lives on. And finally, and now we have a film about him. I really dedicated myself to this impossible dream straight out of college. And it was at a very depressing time. I worked as a community organizer in 2004 to try to stop Bush from being reelected. Bush, of course, won again. I wanted to disappear. I was so disheartened. I was just sinking in my despair. I saved up a bunch of money from working in college, and I decided to use that money to go live abroad in Ukraine and take my grandfather's memoir, which he had written in Ukrainian shortly before he passed away, with me. And so I needed help on where to go to Ukraine. I was traveling alone. I was just like 22 or 23. And I heard about this very cheap program to live abroad with college students. And I showed up in this program in Western Ukraine in the beautiful medieval city of Lviv, and met lifelong friends who changed my life completely. In my research in Ukraine, I discovered Gareth Jones for the first time. My screenplay was coming together, and I really felt like I was healing myself and recharging for the larger battle against the forces that were taking over my country. And so Andriy Maximovich was the young Ukrainian college student that organized that program, along with his dear friend Mykola Peck, who was blind. And even despite that, he made a major impact with organizing university students to work on civic issues and to build a strong, free, independent, democratic Ukraine. Mykola Peck passed away a few years ago, and Andriy has kept up a scholarship fund in his honor and his name. And so I'm going to link to that in the show notes so people can check that out and see where my journey began, thanks to these young, energetic, idealistic Ukrainians who have built so much despite what their country has been through. So if you want to know where my optimism comes from, where I helped get the audacity to even make a film myself with no Hollywood connections or whatnot, it's because of watching Ukrainians on the front lines essentially nation build against great odds and work for what they believed in. And so I felt very obligated and honored to go out to London to see my old friend and thank him for being at the very start of this journey, and to let you all know that the seeds we plant, whether it's a college program that you helped start from 14 years ago, that allowed a random girl in California, me, to make a film. So just understand that the little actions that we do, the tiny little acts that we do, they can send a huge ripple effect across space and time, and be very humble to the fact that you do not know the outcome of the little seeds you plant, but just have faith that your seeds carry enormous potential, and to never stop planting them, and to carry out all your actions with good intention and with immense faith, because you never know what it will lead to. So I just wanted to share that, because I know everything is dark and heavy, but ultimately hold on to your faith, and including the faith in your actions. No action is too small.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a time where obviously we need to take the long view. The people who are hurting this country, the people who are endangering the world at large, are people who have taken the long view for their own agenda. And it's a very ruthless agenda, and it's a very dark agenda. And I've also worked in or with countries that have been authoritarian kleptocracies for a very long time, forever, essentially. Places like Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan. And, people I know there who have worked as dissidents, many of whom have been forced to leave, I don't think any of them have ever given up on the broader struggle or had the illusion that change was going to be instantaneous, that officials could be trusted, that, their own instincts should be doubted in terms of evaluating the situation and seeing it for as dark as what it is. And I am seeing, incremental process, in both of those countries and in other places. Sometimes it comes from something completely outside of our power, like in Uzbekistan, it was because their dictator died, finally, after about 28 years of rule. I hope that that's not the outcome in our case, and you can't quite make the comparison because historically, we have been a democracy. We have different expectations. We have expectations of freedom of speech, of freedom of assembly. We have rights, and those rights are not always honored in practice by state officials, but we should fight for them and act as if they're there nonetheless. Because once you kind of seed that, whether in your own actions or in your mindset, that's where the win is. Their win is in surrender. It's, not necessarily in subjugation. You obviously want to avoid subjugation at all costs, both for yourself and for others. But it's that mindset of, well, this is just the way things are. There is no point in even trying to change them, to challenge them, to expose them, to document them. That is the loss. And, at the same time, I see that occasionally. And then I see what's more the American version of this, which is, American exceptionalism and naive optimism, this refusal to see problems for as severe and as structural as they are, this savior syndrome and normalcy bias and all these other phenomena that we've discussed on this show so many times. I'm seeing that now, but I do feel like the Senate trial, the GOP uniting and refusing to allow witnesses, helping Trump in making this a sham, destroying legal precedent, destroying legal institutions. This is what they've been striving to do for decades. And now we're at the culmination. And so people need to look at this to critically reevaluate what their strategy should be and keep pressing forward. And as you said, our advantage is the unexpected. You can predict what an autocrat is going to do. That's why people use terms like the dictator's playbook, because it is so standard. And Trump has been following it the whole time. What you cannot predict is public response to that aspiring dictator. And you can't predict, especially in a country as big and as diverse as ours, what the public is going to do. So again, we encourage you to fight back in whatever way you can. It does not have to be the same way that everybody else is. It could be a way that highlights your own skills and abilities and reflects the concerns of your own local community. That's a good thing. This idea that we need to conform and be in lockstep is so misguided. That's not the same thing as unity. You could have diversity in approach and a broader unity, a solidarity at the same time. So anyway, I hope people strive for that.
So we have the Iowa caucus, which, Sarah and I we've been saying for a while now, work your heart out for whichever character sets your soul on fire, because by doing so, that's how you're going to find your people that are going to sustain you in the long war ahead to Trump-proof and Putin-proof our democracy. So just if your candidate did not win in Iowa caucus, and we're recording this before the results come in. So, for instance, if Elizabeth Warren, the candidate that our show has endorsed, does not win tonight, we're still going to be taking her plans and looking at what we really like about them and breaking them down, having experts chime in on them, and proposing actions people can take on the state level. We'll be doing that long after the 2020 election because that's why we endorsed her. She's somebody that came up with concrete plans on how to Trump-proof and Putin-proof our democracy. And that's going to be a roadmap of coverage for us and discussions for us, along with other plans and proposals that we like from the other candidates. So follow your heart no matter what. Don't be discouraged if your candidate didn't win tonight. Understand that all of us need to stay engaged for the next decade plus to finally undo the coalition of corruption that has brought us to this disastrous point. So we'll be talking on this episode about two trials where the verdicts were largely determined by a pervasive culture of Kremlin propaganda. One is the fake trial in the Senate of Donald Trump, and the second is the trial of a young Ukrainian soldier with Italian citizenship who was sentenced to 24 years in prison in Italy in a court case largely based on hearsay where there was no proper investigation, and Kremlin propaganda was used in the conviction in a country like Italy where there's a widespread friendly attitude towards Putin and Kremlin propaganda generally, according to a 2018 report by Politico. So today's episode is about how Russian propaganda is serving as both judge and jury. This is coming as the Russian propaganda machine, Donald Trump, who regularly pushes Kremlin conspiracy theories like Ukraine hacked the 2016 election, or Ukraine stole, rather, the 2016 election, and regularly talks to Putin, and whose family has regularly relied on Russian financing to stay afloat. All of this is coming on the heels of this Russian propaganda machine delivering the State of Union address. Trump was, of course, brought to power with the help of a sweeping Russian propaganda campaign across all available social media platforms. And Russian hackers, that's in the US, and Russian hackers stole emails and documents from leaders of both the Republican and Democratic parties and unleashed those materials from the Democrats to hurt and divide Trump's opposition in 2016, weakening his opposition in that election. And they've been trying to do the same in 2020, which got Trump impeached. So Russian propaganda, whether it's on social media, whether it's being pushed on YouTube, a highly effective platform for furthering disinformation, or TV through RT, Russia Today, or echoed on Fox News, Russian propaganda is hacking our justice system here in America. And it's also doing the same in Italy, as our special guest, Ukrainian investigative journalist Olga Tokariuk explains. So we'll go into that larger discussion. Some of it, Olga gets into the weeds, which I know may not be for everyone, but understand what she is doing is leaving here on the show a invaluable record on this complicated court case, which is necessary because, as she points out, some Western observers, including in the Washington Post, get things wrong because it is a complicated case and there are heavy emotions. But what is at heart in this story is a Kafka-esque trial of a young man in Italy. And it's a warning to all of us that the disinformation we see on social media, the bot farms and so forth, yes, it does have a real world impact. Yes, it does help swing elections like in Brexit and Trump. And in Italy's case, it's a big warning. The UK is no longer part of the EU. The UK has officially left the EU. Listen to this interview and ask yourself whether Italy might be next. So this conversation has important lessons for all of us to pay attention to. And in furthering our interest in Elizabeth Warren and our past discussions on her, Elizabeth Warren has pledged a really interesting plan, and Wired did a great breakdown of it. I'm going to read from Wired's piece on Elizabeth Warren's plan to take on disinformation online. So here I'm quoting from Wired. People complain about Facebook and Google as if they're the government, because when it comes to online discourse, they basically are. Warren's recommendations, while not getting into too many specifics, are generally reasonable and track what many experts have been saying for the past few years. Shutting down accounts that spread lies about how to vote would be a stronger deterrent than just taking down the posts. Making more data available would help researchers figure out more about how disinformation works and spreads. But ultimately, the choice of what to implement or not comes down to a tiny handful of executives with no accountability to voters and no real business competition. Warren knows that, of course. No politician has more aggressively argued that the likes of Facebook and Google are too dominant and should be broken up. In the meantime, she seems determined to use the only power she really has to affect their behavior, the bully pulpit. Her proposal calls out Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey, and YouTube CEO Susan Wojcicki by name, urging them to take real steps right now to fight disinformation. So whoever wins the Iowa caucus, Sarah and I have no idea as of February 3rd, Monday morning, but we are still have our eyes on the prize, which is how to Trump-proof and Putin-proof our democracy. And Elizabeth Warren's plans are an interesting roadmap for us on how to do that. And we're, of course, including other experts and other campaign solutions in that as well. But she's been our North Star so far on that matter. We encourage everyone to stay focused on the bigger picture, because if we don't, we will end up with Ivanka Trump as president, and then Don Jr. as president, and then Jared Kushner as president. So it's finally time for us to come together as a society and force accountability in our country.
Well said. And I would just like to add to that, I encourage people to look at Warren's actual plan on fighting digital disinformation, because ironically, the mainstream media, in particular, CNBC, wrote a propagandistic, misleading headline describing that plan, which didn't accurately do it. So, this is just another reminder that no matter which candidate you prefer, to go to the source, to always use primary sources, to look through their own plans, look at their own words, double check that things aren't being manipulated. And, this applies to everybody. And on that note, we're going to now play our interview with a Ukrainian journalist who knows all too well the dangers of this phenomenon. And we encourage you also to look for journalists like this who are working within corrupt countries, who are working, within dictatorships. When you're studying those countries, and especially when you're reflecting on their intersection with the United States, as we have to do with Ukraine, which is the centerpiece of this Senate trial, look for the people who are on the ground really telling those stories and hear what they have to say.
And with that, here's our interview with Ukrainian investigative journalist Olga Tokariuk. Sarah and I today are speaking with Ukrainian journalist Olga Tokariuk of Hromadska television. Olga, could you give us a little bit about your background, which I think is very interesting, because your coverage as a journalist straddles two worlds, Ukraine and Italy. And the story of Russian disinformation that we're going to be speaking about today is very much a case study, a warning for all of us on how Russian disinformation, as we saw with Brexit and the election of Trump, can have a massive influence on elections. And your story that you're going to talk with us about today shows how Russian disinformation generally, can tip the scales of justice in a court. So this is a very troubling story, which you're going to unpack for us today. But could you go in a little bit about yourself and your background, and also the significance of Hromadska, which you work for?
Hello, Andrea. Yes, I'm Olga Tokariuk, a Ukrainian journalist. I've been working as a journalist for about 15 years, mostly covering foreign news. And Italy has been my focus because as a teenager, I learned Italian language on my own just because I liked it. And then I had this particular sentiment towards Italy. I first went there as a journalist, and generally my first time was when I was 22. I was already working on one of leading Ukrainian TV stations at the time. And then I went to study in Italy to get my master's degree at the University of Bologna, where I studied international relations and political science. So, knowing Italian and speaking Italian, having some background with Italy, well, I came back to Ukraine in 2013, just a couple of months before the protests on Maidan started, which have become known as a Revolution of Dignity. After these protests, when the war was unfolding in the eastern Ukraine, I joined Hromadske, an independent Ukrainian TV station where I continue working still, covering mostly foreign news, but also things connected to Italy, yes, and things connected to Ukraine in other countries, like how some Ukrainian context and Ukrainian events play out in other countries. And so I'm coming to this issue we're going to discuss today. The Ukrainian soldier, Vitaly Markiv, who was arrested in Italy in 2017 and accused of deliberate murder of two journalists who died in 2014 near Slovyansk in eastern Ukraine. Their names were Andrea Rocchelli, he was Italian photojournalist, and Andrei Mironov, his Russian interpreter, very famous dissident. In a way, we can call him the enemy of Putin's regime. He was quite a famous person in the West as well, and he spoke perfect Italian. That's how they worked together. That's how they found each other, Andy Rocchelli and Andrei Mironov. So these two people, when they died in May 2014, it seemed like they were the casualty of war. This is the war, reporters die. And it seemed that it was like this. But then suddenly, 3 years later, a Ukrainian soldier was arrested in Italy and accused of their murder. The trial was going on in the native city of Andrea Rocchelli, the murdered photojournalist. And after a year of trial, a Ukrainian soldier was given 24 years sentence for his complicity in this murder. So this is a short story. The long story is different because there are big doubts about whether this Ukrainian soldier really has to do anything with this murder. And also about the trial itself, because during the trial, very few, if any, direct evidence was presented. Some sources and some testimonies used by court were also questionable. There were some documents which turned to be fake, taken by Russian propaganda websites. There were some Russia Today videos. Well, with this I have less issues because Russia Today was probably the only international outlet working in Slovyansk at the time, so maybe to show the scene what was going on, these videos might have been useful. But the fact that the fake document from Ruskaya Vesna, Russian Spring propaganda website, was used as evidence in court is really disturbing. But these are not the only things that are disturbing about this trial.
Reading about this story, which we'll link to articles in the show notes so people can read up on this case, what's essentially happened, with the world going the way it is, it's never been a more dangerous time to be a journalist. Murders of journalists are on the rise. And so with the horrible deaths of these two journalists in eastern Ukraine, a part that is being invaded by Russia, essentially you've had in Italy, to avenge their murders, you've had media press freedom groups rising up to demand justice in their case, which is a wonderful thing to do, very much in principle. But what has happened is that a Ukrainian soldier who also has Italian citizenship, on very, very extraordinarily thin hearsay, quote unquote, evidence, has been convicted for their murder. And in supporting this case, there's Russian-backed Kremlin-funded outlets that have been used in the sentencing itself. Because the case is so thin, there's barely, we're talking about actual hearsay. And so when you read about this case, it feels like a Kafka trial against this Ukrainian soldier.
Well, yes, it is true. Disturbing elements for me personally in this story are those that the first thing, the investigators, they didn't go to the scene, which is the first thing that you would normally do. And they said they didn't go to the scene to look at where all it happened because it was still dangerous in Ukraine. Well, it's a weird statement because the place where the events happened It was, yes, occupied by Russian forces, by pro-Russian separatists and Russian forces back in May 2014. But since July 2014, it has been liberated by the Ukrainian army, and now this is a government-controlled territory. It is absolutely safe. I've been there twice in the recent months, at the place where journalists died, and at the hill where Marky was stationed, and from which, according to the prosecution, he was shooting at the journalists. And it is completely safe, so everything can be done there. But investigators decided not to go. They also didn't accept any offers from the Ukrainian government to create a joint investigation team, basically saying that Ukraine had a chance to investigate these murders in 2014 and in 2015, and if it didn't do it, well, then it doesn't make sense to collaborate with Ukraine now, despite numerous requests by the Ukrainian government after the arrest of Markiv to create this joint investigation team and to do the investigation together. So basically, investigators didn't go to the scene. They, out of 3 people who survived in that attack, because with 2 journalists, there were 3 other people. One French photographer, William Roguelon, and he was the only one who was heard in court as a witness. And there were 2 other Ukrainian citizens. So these 2 other Ukrainian citizens, they were never called to testify in court. We talked to them. I'm saying it's me and my Italian colleagues, because we are now working on a documentary, on an investigation, what really happened there. So we managed to track those witnesses and talk to them. And their version of events is very different from the one that was told in court by the only witness heard.
Right. And so I want to go back to the outlet that you work for, Hromadska, and explain to our audience the significance of Hromadska, just so they could better understand the position you're taking, where you come from in Ukraine. Because what you're challenging here in Italy is a court case that is very much backed up by a political correctness, essentially, an orthodoxy that's difficult to challenge, because it is true that you absolutely must have justice for the murder of journalists anywhere. But here, in seeking that justice, the effort itself is undermining itself by trying to force a conviction based on hearsay, which is not justice by any means. And so you're coming in as a team of journalists to try to investigate what actually happened and do the work that the official investigators don't seem willing so far to do. And so you're no stranger to tackling inconvenient truths. Hromadska TV, for instance, your network, it exists online only. You guys have stayed independent, largely donor funded, and you've resisted any efforts to join the gaggle of oligarch-owned TV networks that exist in Ukraine. You have a bunch of oligarch-owned TV networks in Ukraine, and Hromadska has remained independent, which limits you to existing only online. You were founded by a group of journalists, many who quit a major network based on alleged censorship. And one of your founders launched the revolution in Ukraine with a Facebook post. That's, of course, Mustafa Nayyem. So your little nucleus also includes Sergei Leshchenko of Ukrainska Pravda, who's right down the hall from your studio in Kiev. Sergei Leshchenko, of course, is the Ukrainian investigative journalist that exposed Paul Manafort's Black Ledger story that finally got Manafort officially kicked off the Trump campaign, but Manafort hung out in the background and never really left. And Sergei Leshchenko is a favorite of the Kremlin-driven conspiracy theory pushed by the Republican Party to try to blame Ukraine for interfering in the 2016 election, which is not true. It's a conspiracy theory. So just to really hit home for people, Olga is part of a fearless group of Ukrainian investigative journalists that are doing essential work, and they get attacked for it, even by Ukrainians who call them out for being pro-Kremlin when they dare to go very hard in taking on Ukraine's own corruption. And so you guys are as objective and as fearless as it comes as investigative journalists. So I just want to make that clear for people, because I think your background is really interesting and important to the story and the lessons that we can all learn.
Yes, I've been working at Hromadske for almost 6 years. I joined in April 2014, and it's still a big honor for me to be a part of this team. I'm really proud that we are an independent outlet, that I have a freedom as a journalist to do what I think is right to do, what I think the duty of journalist is to do, to talk about two sides of each story, to choose my topics and my arguments freely without any editorial or oligarchic pressure. Well, I had experience working at other mainstream media in Ukraine, let's say, and oligarchic TV stations, because unfortunately there's not much choice. But since I joined Hromadske in 2014, I actually promised to myself that I never go back to work in oligarchic media, because the contrast is so big, you know. Like here I can feel I can really do my job properly, and I'm very proud of the team of my colleagues whom I'm working with. But when I'm coming to this story, the Vitaly Markiv and Andrea Rocchelli and Andrei Mironov story, well, this documentary I already mentioned earlier, I'm making it with, yes, some support from Hromadske, but mostly as an independent journalist with a group of my 3 other colleagues from Italy. Their names are Cristiano Tinazzi, Danilo Elia, and Ruben Lagattola. They are also mostly freelancers. One of them works at RAI, at the Italian public TV station. But you know, what we encountered when we started working on this documentary is that it is very difficult to talk about this issue and this tragic events in Italy, because in this trial against the Ukrainian soldier, the Italian Federation of Journalists and the Regional Association of Journalists of the region of Lombardy, from where Andrea Rocchelli was from, they were on the side of the prosecution. So, in a way, they see this case as closed. They see, okay, there was a sentence, the Ukrainian soldier was given his 24-year sentence. They don't see any problem with how this trial was conducted. Moreover, they say that basically this was a deliberate attack on journalists, although there is no proof that it was a deliberate attack. Well, it was a very hot conflict zone. It was a very dangerous place where 2 journalists died. Basically, it was the front line, just that at that point of the conflict, there was no clear front line. So this was the place where 2 sides of the conflict were shooting at each other daily, looking at it as a deliberate murder and saying that Ukrainian soldiers somehow from the distance of 2 kilometers was able to distinguish journalists, to realize that they were journalists and they were not wearing any press vests or helmets or any signs of for which they could be recognized apart from wearing photo cameras. Anyway, the Ukrainian soldiers were 2 kilometers away, and as we found while filming our documentary, it was very difficult to see them also because there was a train, it was a railway passage, and near the railway passage there was a ditch where journalists died. So the train on the railway passage, which separatists used as a barricade, it was obstructing the view further. I'm coming back to where I started, that all these facts, they didn't generate any suspicion on the Italian side. So even my Italian colleagues and me and we in Italy are facing enormous pressure and reluctance of the other side to talk to us. So basically they say, well, if you're making this movie, if you are doing this investigation, this means that you support, that you want to, liberate Vitaly Markiv. But in fact, we want to do a proper investigation because it was never done. As I said, the investigators didn't go to the scene. We went there twice. The investigators didn't talk to the witnesses who were at the scene, apart from one person. We did. So what we are doing, we are really trying to find the truth, what happened that day at that place. But we are facing accusations in Italy and that we are being biased, that people from the Italian Federation of Journalists either ignore us or say explicitly that they don't want to comment on this case. So, it is also very hard to work in these conditions because we would like to talk to all parts and present all points of view. But we just can't because there is so much opposition and so much unwillingness to support this independent investigation.
It's chilling how closed their minds are in Italy to the truth. And a man was convicted to 24 years, right? 24 years?
Yes.
A man was convicted to 24 years in prison based on hearsay. And part of his conviction included Kremlin-funded propaganda being put on the record in court. So what is the climate currently, the political climate like in Italy that might be contributing to this?
Well, when I talk about it with my Italian colleagues, they actually say that it's not much about, the politics or propaganda. Well, they believe that it might have been some human mistakes that this verdict was like this. So what they tried to tell me is that they don't think there was some huge role of propaganda or disinformation behind it. But what I noticed, even reading the motivation of this sentence, well, the Italian court used some phrases which are basically taken from Russian propaganda or, the way Russian media talk about the situation in Ukraine. For example, Ukrainian army and Ukrainian National Guard are called irregular forces, as if they were almost on the same level as separatists, So there is no direct distinction even in the materials of the case, but in those phrases framed by judges, that there is a regular army and regular forces who defend their country and their territory, and then there is Russian-funded and Russian-backed and unrest separatists and some Russian intelligence officers who were directing these separatists at the time, like Igor Strelkov. The role of the separatists was never investigated in court. At trial, there was no assumption that separatists might have been responsible. And also, it was not taken into account the situation on the ground, that two ceramics factories are nearby this railway crossing where this tragic death occurred. And these factories were taken over by the separatists. So there were separatist positions 400 meters from the place where journalists died. So this was not taken into account by the court. Instead, they were insisting that Ukrainian army was targeting journalists, that it was persecuting journalists, again using some OEC report. If you look at that report, you'll see that a biggest part of that report talks about violations of journalists' rights and attacks on journalists on the separatist territories. So there are some incidents also in Ukrainian controlled territories. We are talking about spring 2014. But most of that report says that all the violations and attacks on journalists, they occur and they are made by separatists. But this document, again in court, was presented as a proof that the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian authorities and Ukrainian soldiers attack journalists. But it is a clear manipulation, So this small, I don't know if there was some orchestrated disinformation or propaganda campaign behind this case. Maybe not. Maybe it's really, as my Italian colleagues say, just some human mistakes, some incompetence or Russian narratives that were so present in the Italian media. But even if there was no orchestrated campaign, still this little Russian narrative here, little Russian narrative there, no direct witnesses from the Ukrainian side, no investigation at the scene, no understanding of the context and inclusion of the context, of the real context in the, court files, it all might have contributed to this outrageous sentence.
To touch on your point, Italy suffers from a Kremlin propaganda problem. Here's a March 2018 article out of Politico called How Italy Does Putin's Work. And I'm going to read from it. From the United States to France and Britain, officials have warned about Russian attempts to swing elections through various meddling techniques. In Italy, not so much. In the run-up to the election on Sunday, in March 2018, sympathy for Russian President Vladimir Putin among many lawmakers and voters is out in the open. The friendly attitude filters through social media and traditional publishers, which means pro-Putin messaging that would be considered propaganda or misinformation elsewhere is uncontroversial in the Eurozone's third largest economy. And it goes on to quote Anna Pelagata, a digital forensic research assistant at the Atlantic Council, a think tank monitoring the risk of digital falsities worldwide. And she says, Italy is a weird exception among Western states because the relationship between Italian politicians and Putin is very open. The line between misinformation and officials promoting Russian messages is very blurred. So it sounds like this young Ukrainian soldier who received 24 years in prison in Italy for murdering 2 journalists in the war in eastern Ukraine, a conviction of 24 years based largely on hearsay and backed by Kremlin propaganda. That seems like a symptom, or not even a symptom, but it's being born of a larger culture in Italy.
Well, Italy has historically had very strong ties with the former Soviet Union and then with Russia. It's no surprise that some pro-Russian narrative is very persistent and very dominant in the Italian public and private discourse and in the media as well. When it comes to this case, to this particular case of the Ukrainian soldier, what was striking for me, it was that immediately after his arrest in the summer of 2017, Italian media went out with the headlines that the killer was arrested. So there was no presumption of innocence, nothing like that. So the media already got their headlines that he's a killer. And then this continued during the trial. The articles appearing in the Italian media, they portrayed him as a nationalist and Ukrainian army who was defending its territory in Donbass as some dangerous thugs. And these articles were also talking about Ukrainians who live in Italy, who went to the court to support Vitaly Markiv. They were describing these people who are mostly, women in their 50s who work in Italy as caregivers or cleaners or other, in domestic services mostly. So the media in Italy were describing these women as nationalists because they were wearing embroidered shirts. This is the sign of Ukrainian nationalism in Italy, dangerous nationalism.
It's this horrible tendency for people with a political agenda in the West to dismiss Ukrainian patriotism, wanting to live free in a Western-style open democracy and not be trapped and oppressed under Kremlin colonialism. There's this horrible tendency to dismiss Ukrainian patriotism as Ukrainian nationalism.
Yes, and also I was surprised that, they never talked to these people. So they described them, dismissing them as nationalists, saying that they have shaved heads and stuff like that, and that the slogan "Glory to Ukraine," which is a patriotic slogan and the slogan of the Ukrainian army, the official slogan of the Ukrainian army, saying that this is a Nazi slogan. But they never talked to these people. No journalist who wrote about this case that I read, no article I read, and I read, I think, most of them, has ever talked neither to these people who went to the court. They didn't talk to Vitaly Markiv's lawyer, who is an Italian lawyer, Raffaele Della Valle, one of the best Italian lawyers. So they didn't even talk to him. And they didn't talk to representatives of the Ukrainian diaspora in Italy, who are very active in this case and who are very open also to give comments. They didn't talk to Vitaly Markiv's mother, who lives in Italy, who has her husband there, and Vitaly lived in Italy. That's how actually he was arrested, because he was coming back to visit his mother in Italy. He still has dual citizenship, Italian-Ukrainian. So, that was also some bad journalism, and I think there was bias from the Italian media because the Ukrainian side of the story was never represented.
No wonder Steve Bannon wanted to build his far-right academy where he was going to teach propaganda secrets in Italy, because it just seems like a natural environment for him. So the Washington Post did an article on this as well, and when I posted it on Twitter, you called it out for having some inaccuracies. What were some of the things that the Washington Post got wrong when it came to this story?
Well, it's a very interesting article. I read it with great interest, and I basically liked half of it until it came to the conclusions. Well, I understand that the author was a very good friend of Andrei Mironov, the Russian dissident and interpreter who died in this tragic accident alongside with Andrea Rocchelli. And he described his relationship very close with Andrei and the way the person Andrei was. But then he went on to tried to reconstruct what happened, but he was only basing his reconstruction on the testimonies of two people. At least I understood it like that. He put it like he wrote that he talked to people who helped him to reconstruct the events of that day. And that was, one of them was William Roguelon, the only testimony who was heard in court, the French photographer who survived. And William Roguelon is a person who changed his testimony because when he was first asked in 2014 after the events what happened, he said that he didn't know who was shooting at journalists. But then in court in 2017, he said that he was sure it was the Ukrainian army, although he couldn't provide any proof of that. And then the other source of Will Englund, the author of the Washington Post article, was Russian human rights defender, at least she calls her like this, Oksana Chelysheva, who used to be a really famous journalist, a friend of Anna Politkovskaya, who covered war in Chechnya, and she's been living in Finland as a political refugee, as far as I understand, for a couple of years. And she claims that she did her own investigation of what happened, and she was a friend of Andrei Mironov as well. But I saw her in court during the verdict, and when I went online to check who this person was, I found out that, yes, she wrote a lot about this case, and she wrote a lot about Andrei Mironov, and she wrote a lot about the events, about the war in Donbass. But every time she wrote about the war in Donbass, she only accused the Ukrainian side of killing civilians. I never saw any post from her saying that the separatists also had the responsibility, that they were shelling from the residential areas, and they were, and this is an established fact. And this person, she organized some events in various European countries, in Finland and in Belgium, in other countries, saying that the Ukrainian army was deliberately attacking journalists, and again tying it to this case, to the murder of Andrei Mironov and Andrea Rocchelli, although there was, again, and there is no proof of that. For me, this person is a questionable source because I can see that her coverage of the war is very one-sided. And when she talks about defending rights of civilians, she only wants to defend them from the Ukrainian army, but never from the separatists and from their crimes. So that was one thing. And then there were also some factual mistakes in that article. For example, the author says that on the morning when the journalist died, it was all quiet, but it wasn't. While working on our documentary, we talked to locals in Slovyansk who told us that there was a very heavy bombardment that morning. They also told us a lot of other details which I don't want to reveal yet because I want you to watch our documentary to support it. You can find our Facebook page. It's called The Wrong Place, and there is a link to crowdfunding. Many pieces of the puzzle were missing. And also, it looked, again, as if it was unclear what Ukrainians were doing there, from the article. Also, the author says that for Ukrainians, Markiv is a hero. That's why they defend him. But the point is not that he is a hero. The point is that the trial doesn't seem to be fair, that it doesn't seem there is any direct evidence against him. And that's why Ukrainians defend him, not because they think he's their hero.
It seems very emotionally driven.
Yes, exactly.
And the culture of Kremlin propaganda being welcomed or accepted by traditional institutions in Italy, from politicians to traditional media establishments, that's a culture that likely help drive this verdict, it sounds like. So what are the lessons here for us, in your opinion? What are sort of the warning signs? What should we take from this case? What's the larger story here?
Well, the most worrying sign for me is that it might set a dangerous precedent because it's the first time that the Ukrainian soldier was convicted abroad for his actions or alleged actions during the war, for targeting civilians, for deliberately targeting and killing journalists. And more disturbingly, that he was accused of doing so in the absence of any direct proof, in the absence of proper investigation on the scene, in the absence of collaboration with the Ukrainian authorities that were dismissed immediately by the Italian side as not credible. this is not how the justice is done, in my opinion, and this sets really a dangerous precedent. Another thing which is disturbing is that it's not just one Ukrainian soldier. The case was also against the state of Ukraine. So basically, all state of Ukraine, Ukrainian regular army, was accused of committing crimes against civilians, against journalists, and doing it deliberately. So again, based on no direct proof, based on indirect witnesses, on, without any proper investigation. So these are really worrying signs. And also, of course, the role of disinformation and propaganda. I don't know how coordinated it was. Maybe these were really some accidental, small things that in the end contributed to this bigger picture. But I think we should be aware of how, every message that is being pushed through by Russian disinformation and propaganda, how it can be interpreted and how can it stick to the minds not just of politicians, but ordinary people, but people in tribunals, by jurors, because the jury was given the sentence. So, it's again a warning sign that the hybrid war is being conducted on so many levels, and the disinformation and propaganda is one of them.
The larger lesson here also includes the reminder that culture is powerful. And if you have a culture in Italy that exists that largely accepts Kremlin propaganda, that is going to seep in to all sorts of areas of society. And it reminds me of what brings me and my co-host Sarah together. That is, on the left, because we consider ourselves progressives in America, on the left, it's always been fashionable for a lot of progressive activists to appear on Kremlin-funded outlets like Russia Today and to amplify articles and videos and TV hosts from Russia Today, RT, and other Kremlin-funded outlets. And as a result, hanging out among other American progressives, I would hear some depressing Kremlin talking points against Ukraine from a lot of progressives that I shared a lot of views with. They would say things to me like, oh, it was a violent coup in Ukraine. It was a far-right coup in Ukraine. They would repeat Kremlin talking points to me because on the left in America, for a very long time, for many years, we had this culture where it was acceptable for people on the left to appear on Russia Today, RT, and other blood money funded propaganda outlets. So the warning is to us on the left in America that you have to take a universal stance against totalitarianism everywhere in all its forms and not accept to appear on any blood money networks like RT, Russia Today, because what you're doing is you're furthering a destructive culture that can seep into your thinking. And maybe you agree with some points that they make, but you'll find yourself agreeing with totally inaccurate information, like furthering the Kremlin talking point, furthering the Kremlin propaganda that it was a far-right Ukrainian coup and not a popular uprising that toppled Putin's puppet in Ukraine, Yanukovych, brought to power with Manafort's help. So yeah, this is a very serious case study. It's depressing that this emotional trial in Italy and Kremlin propaganda helped sentence this Ukrainian soldier, a young man, to 24 years in prison. I hope your documentary helps his case and gets the truth out and also confronts journalists around the world who aren't abiding by a strict, objective, clear-eyed look at this story, which is desperately needed given how muddied it's been in Italy. So can we talk a little bit about how strange it is, given the years you and I have known each other, how strange it is now to look this week at the Senate voting on whether or not to remove Donald Trump from office over Ukraine, over how he tried to exonerate, how he tried to force your president to invent a scandal on our former vice president, his political opponent, in exchange for much needed aid that your country had to have in order to defend itself against the second most powerful military in the world. Could you comment on what that's like, seeing your country at the center of an impeachment trial of the President of the United States?
I think I have to disappoint you here because unfortunately or fortunately, in Ukraine, it is not discussed that widely, because there are so many internal issues and events in Ukraine that are happening every day. We have so many internal scandals and squabbles that the issue of impeachment is not really high on the agenda. Everybody, I guess, by now knows in Ukraine that Donald Trump was impeached over Ukraine. There were high expectations before the visit of the State Secretary Pompeo to Kyiv. There are big fears that Ukraine might lose, in a way, the bipartisan support that it enjoyed in the U.S. Because of this story, that it is becoming toxic for the U.S. political establishment, that nobody wants to deal with Ukraine now. We will see whether these fears are justified. Secretary Pompeo in Kiev said that the relationship is still strong, that the bipartisan support to Ukraine is still strong, but there are facts that there is no U.S. ambassador in Ukraine after Bill Taylor left his post before the new year. There is no special representative, the U.S. special representative in Ukraine after Kurt Volker resigned in September. So looking at deeds, not words, it doesn't really look that rosy. However, there were some pledges of financial support, that it will remain intact, that there will be a U.S. support to the Ukraine defense and army this year and the next year. So hopefully that will remain, that will stay in place. However, I don't think our president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has any more hopes of having a White House meeting until the U.S. presidential elections.
Wow. Okay. So another win for Putin during this critical time, with so much hanging in the balance for Ukraine and its future, including its sovereignty. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. It's inspiring, and it's helping to show the way for the rest of us on how to confront these 21st century problems of insidious propaganda and how dangerous it is, and how just because it exists online in a tweet on Facebook doesn't mean it doesn't carry a massive impact and serious repercussions, including destroying possibly innocent lives. So thank you for the work that you do, and we always appreciate hearing from you.
Thank you.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage our listeners to help the victims of the Australian fires by donating to the Australian Red Cross, working on the ground to help people in need. For help directed towards Australia's First Nations communities, check out the Fire Relief Fund for First Nations Communities by Neil Morris. We've posted links to these groups and others on our Patreon page.
We also encourage you to donate to WIRES, a group that rescues native Australian wildlife in distress. Donate at wires.org.au. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It helps keep us going.
Our production managers, who we sorely need, are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level and higher on Patreon. Adam Ingersoll,
Adam Levine,
Alabama,
Alan Liu,
Angela Harvey,
Ann Marshall,
Becky Karush,
Brian Tajudin.
I think it's Tahudin. I'm not sure. Brian, tell us what it is. Carl Hosier,
Carol Goldstad,
Catherine Anderson Carana,
Kathy Kavanaugh,
C. Baker,
David Porter,
Diana Gallagher,
D.L. Singfield,
Dorothy Kamarick,
Doug Friedenberg,
Elizabeth Dove,
Eric Kaplan,
Irina Guardia,
Ethan Mann,
Bontaine Carpenter,
George Hughes,
Gordon Shumway,
Gustav Halsby,
James Tolley,
Gerald Lombardo,
Jason Benke,
Jason Rita,
Jeff Thompson,
Jennifer Slavic,
Jans Alstrup Rasmussen,
Jill Newman,
John Laughlin,
John Ripley,
Karen Crouch,
Karen Humphreys,
Kate Cotton,
Katie Musuris,
Kelly Ranson,
Kevin M. Garnett,
Kim Mellon,
Christy Vitale,
Lawrence Graham,
Leo Chalupa,
Lisa LaFlame,
Lorraine W. Todd,
Luke Stranad,
Mandy Farapur,
Marcus J. Trent,
Margaret Moe,
Margaret Romero,
Matt Perez,
Maureen Murphy,
Michael Woodridge,
Michelle Dash,
Mike Tripico,
Nicole Spear,
Oliver Ash,
Ray Alba,
Rhonda White,
Rich Craw,
Robert Wegdinsky,
Sonia Bogdanovic,
Solomon Hikes,
Tanya Chalupa, hi Mom,
Victoria Nordgren,
Victoria Olson,
Ren,
Zachary Lemon.
Zap Rousdower.
Thank you all so much for your support. We could not make the show without you.
Thank you.